Welcome to the Firepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff McDowell Jr.
And I'm Bennett Grove.
Between us, we have 20 years of firefighting experience.
And over 15 years of experience building, growing, and leading small businesses.
Each episode, we get after it by discussing leadership, life, and development.
We'll also unpack the wins and losses that we've experienced along the way.
You ready, big dog?
I'm ready, my man.
Let's get it. Hello again, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Firepreneurs Podcast. Today we're going to talk about beginning with the end in mind, and we're going to do a series on this topic. So I'm going to let Bennett kind of tell some stories and why it's important to have your path kind of laid out in front of you as opposed to just meandering down the road.
Absolutely. So the Beginning with the End in Mind series. Today, Jeff and I are just kind of talk about some of those stories and, kind of give you an overview of what the Beginning with the End in Mind series is going to cover. But essentially, you think about it from a perspective where, what do you need to do to get started? So another way to think of this is, okay, we're getting started. So what all do I need to do to get started? Starting a business. And in doing that, we think that it's also important to ask yourself, what is the end going to look like? What is the goal? What do you want to be doing? Where do you want to see the business in 3 to 5 years? That's important because those decisions will dictate a lot of what the first questions you ask are. So, like, for example, one of the first topics we're going to cover in the series is going to be company formation. What type of company are you setting up? Is it going to be a sole proprietorship? Is it going to be an LLC? Is it going to be an S Corp, C Corp? There's these different types of entity formations that you have out there, and those are all different with different advantages, with different requirements, with different challenges. And so you're thinking to yourself, okay, well, that sounds intimidating, and it kind of is at first, but it's all stuff that's easily to overcome if you're beginning with the end in mind. So if you're thinking about where you want your company to go, what you want it to be one day, allow yourself to dream big for a second, then that will help you back into what your company formation may be. So one episode we're going to do is we're going to bring on a tax accountant, a guy I've worked with since 2008, and he's going to talk about the different options. So that's one episode that's coming up. Next one is funding your startup and possible grants that might be available to you. And so we're going to bring on Kedma O, who is a business coach, but she's a small business expert. She wrote a book called Target Funding. She's the VP of coaching for a company called AGS Conquer. She's been my business coach for the last year. And so her book talks about all this money that's available from different government organizations. She worked at the SBA for over a decade. So there's all these different programs that are out there that might even be able to help fund your startup. So she'll talk about that in our second episode. Another episode after that is going to be what numbers should you know from day one, and bookkeeping. So forming your organization with our tax accountant, Adam. We're going to have another guest on, Dan, who runs a business but also was a bookkeeper, and he was someone who was in a Fortune 500 company as in different roles in finance and a financial analyst and lots of other background there. But he's the CEO of a home service company now, and he does bookkeeping as well. And so he'll talk about the power of bookkeeping and getting to know your numbers from day one. So beginning with the end in mind, like, where do you want to go? That may dictate what numbers you need to know from day one. So how you track your numbers, how you go about tracking your numbers, why it's important to set up bookkeeping from day one. There's a certain set of numbers everybody should know in their company regardless. We'll talk a little bit about that. So that's going to be another one of our episodes coming up. And then we're going to talk about the power of trademarking and protecting your brand and your company name. That's going to be an episode. We're going to bring on an intellectual property and trademarking attorney that I've worked with, and he'll come on and bring a lot of value and talk to you about why it's important to do that. So again, there's a beginning with the end in mind. Do you see your company going into different cities? If it's going to go into different cities, you need to make sure that your name can be used in different cities, right? That's just a little highlight of some stuff that we'll talk about in that episode. And so one of the other episodes after that is going to be website creation and search engine optimization. So beginning with the end in mind, you want leads, you want to have a website that's highly functional, you may want that in 3 months. You may want something even bigger at the end. So what you do in the beginning will help prepare you for what that's going to look like. So that's going to be one of our other episodes. And then the series conclusion, the last episode that we'll do, is we'll bring on somebody other than Jeff and I to talk the whole time. And we'll bring on somebody who's built a 7-figure home services business that did so by beginning with the end in mind. So that guest we'll announce later, but the series is going to be a weekly one. So we're going to have a different guest on each week. And this one is just going to be an intro episode for us to let you guys know what's coming. And today we're going to tell some stories of beginning with the end in mind and how it's impactful. And the first thing we're going to do is answer a question that I'm sure many of you might have if you're listening to this, which is, how can I think about where I'm going to be in 5 years when I haven't even started on day one? I haven't made $1 of revenue. I don't even know what service I'm offering yet, or I don't even know what business I am going to start with yet. How can I begin with the end in mind? Jeff, that sounds like a pretty good question.
It does.
And fair.
Yeah. So we have a lot of conversations, obviously, and we always like to play devil's advocate with one another. And
nobody likes a devil's advocate.
Yeah.
It just is what it is.
But it sparks conversation and interesting conversation most times. So we threw out the question back of, how can you start if you don't know where you want to go? Right. It's kind of like getting in your car. Where are you going? I don't know. I'm just driving on this road over here. So if you know where you're going, right, that kind of sets your path on where you're going to go. Kind of another story I learned. I'm sorry, I don't remember where I heard it from, so I can't give credit, but I'm not taking full credit for this, is the story of there's 3 scouts. They're given a task to find the shortest distance to the tree in the distance. And it's snowy out, so they can kind of see their footprints on where they're going. One decides he's going to look straight down at his footprints and try to keep it as straight as possible. The other one decides he's going to look backwards. He's going to walk backwards and see his path, right? He can kind of see and straighten out and see if he's getting off path. And then the other one decides to look straight at the tree and walk that way. So they all eventually make it to the tree and they look at the past. The one that was looking straight down, which is looking straight in the present, was kind of meandering all over the place. He couldn't see where he's going, couldn't see where he'd been. The one that was looking behind him was a little bit straighter, but still was pretty crooked, right? It's a little bit, got off path a little bit here and there. The one that looked straight at the tree the whole time had the straightest path because he had the end in mind.
Right. Attached with some focus too, right?
Correct.
And that's a pretty good metaphor for, like, if you look back at your path and when you don't begin with the end in mind. So let's parallel that with business. When you don't begin with the end in mind, so taking Jeff's analogy here, right? If you're the person looking down at your feet, you're in the present, you're looking at the moment right now, then when you look back, there's going to be lots of zigs and zags. And understandably so. So in business, that is a really good metaphor, because when you just go, and there is a degree where you should take like imperfect action. So like if you have to choose between taking action or inaction, we are fans of imperfect action.
Yes.
But when you take imperfect action and you haven't had this conversation we're having right now of beginning with the end in mind, you're going to have what Jeff just described as the snowy path of zigs and zags, right?
Right. It's a good way to sum it up.
And that's okay, because in business, there's going to be wins and losses. But when you at least start with the end in mind, you're more likely to be akin to the individual that looked at the tree and had the straighter path of the 3.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
And so going with that, Jeff, what is something that, beginning with the end in mind, right now you're starting a business from day one, right?
Right.
What's a question or a consideration? We talked about some of the topics that are going to be coming up down the series here, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for an intro episode, what's something that you could give a listener, a viewer, a takeaway of, how do I begin with the end in mind right now? Go.
The first one is going back to one of our early episodes of the why. Why are you doing this? What's your end goal for this? If it's extra money, how much? And kind of knowing what that number is, and that'll really dictate where your business is going to go from there.
Yeah, I think that's right too. I mean, A good starting point, obviously, is the why. That was our first episode in the Firepreneurs podcast. It's because it's the most important question, beginning with why. There's a book actually written, Beginning with the Why. It's called by Simon Sinek. I might be screwing up the title there, but it's The Power of Why. We talked about that pretty exhaustively in our first episode. So if you want to reference that, go back. It's a good episode, a lot of good insight. But now we're talking about, okay, so now we're beginning. We've got our why. Set the why. The why is the tree that you just talked about, right? Walking the straight path, so to speak.
Right.
So maybe let's go down a scenario here of beginning with the end in mind. Your why is that you want to build a services company that you can do on your days off from the firehouse, right?
Right.
And you want to make it so that your combined take-home income is, you want to make 6 figures. You want to clear 6 figures, right?
Right.
So beginning with the end in mind, math is the path here. So this is why one of our episodes is like learning your numbers, right?
Right.
You have to generate enough revenue so that you make enough profit to supplement your fire department income to make that 6-figure salary. So if we're going to get really linear and walk that straight line here, let's set the end in mind is I want a services company where I make enough money that between my services company and my fire department income, I can make a 6-figure income. Okay, let's roll with that, right?
Right.
So if we're going to begin with the end in mind, we first need to look at what's your take-home income from the fire department. So if you're a firepreneur out there and you make X, let's call it for the sake of conversation, like 50 grand, okay? Which is another example of why I don't think firemen get paid enough, but it's another subject. I like to say this whenever I get a chance: firemen, police officers, teachers, nurses, EMS, those people veteran service members, people out there who sacrifice for their communities, don't get paid enough, but do a lot. Okay, I'm off my soapbox now. Back to the topic. So fireman, 50 grand. Okay, so he wants to make 100. He wants to make 100,000 total, right?
Right.
So that, if we're looking at the beginning with the end in mind, we don't necessarily have to build out a robust company to do that. So if you're a firepreneur and you are wanting to have a business and be a fireman, but your end in mind is just to make it so that you make enough money on your days off to make a 6-figure income between the 2 jobs, right? I would say one of your other ends is making sure that to make that money, you're not giving up all your time away from your family and loved ones. But if that's your end in mind, at this point, that's good to know, because that means we don't necessarily have to build out a really robust company like you would have to if you were building a 7-figure business, a business that's doing 7 figures in revenue. So there's going to be different needs at that point. So what we might be talking about, getting into our first episode, which is company formation, is if we're beginning with the end in mind, we want to make a 6-figure income between the fire department and our off-duty job or off-duty business. Mm-hmm. We might be talking about a sole proprietorship as opposed to perhaps an S corporation. And in that instance, you may just be doing a lot of the work yourself, may have another person from the fire department helping you do some of the work, and you guys make a little income together. You can pay yourselves a wage, and then the profit's left over for you. That doesn't need to be a really big company where we're talking about some of the things we get into, which is leadership development, training. It's going to be more of a sole proprietorship.
Right.
Still a firepreneur, you're right. You're still a firefighter and you have a business on your days off. You're still building a company and you're still beginning with the end in mind. But we're being very clear that, hey, man, my end is I just want to be able to make 6 figures. So you're talking about money. You can get into the why, which is our first episode. But if we're just talking about beginning with the end in mind, that's good, because that sets us up for the next 5 episodes. That gives us those. We're going to hone in. If you're listening and that's you, these next 5 episodes, you can hone in on some of the things that we're going to talk about with these guests.
Right. And the structure, knowing that, is going to change, as you already talked about, the structure of your company. So essentially what we're talking about in this example is you're really the employee. So instead of you being the manager of the company and having employees that you're paying wages to, you're paying yourself that wage, and anything else that covers your expenses and you have some left over, that's just icing on the cake for you. And that's a great side gig for a firefighter for sure. Yep. And there's nothing wrong if you want to do that and don't want to grow past that level of business. But if you do want to grow past that level of business, there becomes a lot more at play. So that's why you kind of need to know what you want out of this company. If that's all you want, that's great. If you want more, there's definitely a lot more you have to think about to get set up for your path towards your tree, so to speak.
Right. And you brought up an important point too, is that there's a difference between being and having a business. So you're a business owner, right? Okay. You're a business owner. You're a firefighter. It's a business owner. You're a firepreneur, right? But if your end in mind is that you just want to have a business that makes that much supplemental income, right? So that you can have that 6-figure take home. Okay. Well, like Jeff said, you're basically doing the work. So yes, you own the business, but really you're an owner operator. You're the one doing the work. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. I know plenty of people in my fire career who have done that, and a lot of traditional instances of firepreneurs where they're firefighters that have a side gig. That's what a lot of them do, and they do well.
Yes,
right. They're happy, they make good money, and they go on vacation with their family every year. And then there's lots of pros to that. The con is Father Time catches up with all of us. So depending on your side gig, at a certain stage in that career, what you haven't built is a business that is pass-onable to a degree. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you do that and you're like, my end in mind is I want to make 6 figures, and I'm between my fire department income and my business, and that's all I want. I want to be able to take that home every year. And when I reach the retirement age at the fire department, I'm going to retire from the fire department, and I'll probably just keep doing my business on the side, or you retire from both, right? So at that stage, though, once you leave the fire department and you go into that business full time and you're doing that work full time, it's even more of like, that's your job. Right. And if you've never groomed anybody, and what Jeff and I, our mission at Firepreneurs is lead, develop, grow. So if you're not doing that, where you lead, develop, and grow, when the time comes that your body's like, all right, that's good, I've had enough of this, right? Ready to hang out. You got your pension. You can chill out now. We don't need to go out here and work my butt off all day. At that point, you don't have anybody to pass the business on to. You have to at that point, you would have to then pivot to training and leading and developing somebody to take it over for you. And at that point, you're no longer the owner operator. So if you think that might be you listening to this story, like, hey, well, now that you brought that up, yeah, when I do reach retirement age, I do want to keep doing this, but I might not actually want to be the one doing the work anymore because I'll have more free time, and I could take the time to train and develop, right?
Right.
Well, then what we just did was we just moved the pole back on the end, right? We're not looking at that tree anymore. We're going to the tree behind it, because now it's not, your end in mind isn't to make 6 figures. Your end is actually to make 6 figures, but also when I reach a certain age, I want to be able to hand off the direct labor. I want to be able to hand off the work to somebody else and then manage the business. Okay, that's good. But that is a different end in mind.
Right.
So when we talk about beginning with the end in mind, these are examples of what is the end. And again, you might be that person like, okay, but like, how the heck am I supposed to know that? You don't have to. You don't, to an extent, but if you're going to go in business, you have to have these kind of conversations with yourself, like what you want out of it, the whys, because that will set your tree that you're walking to, so to speak, and that will help unpack what it's going to take to get there. So that's just another for instance when it comes to beginning with the end in mind.
Yeah, for sure.
Caveat to that, or you have anything to add to that?
Not too much. We'll cover a lot in the coming episodes, so I don't want to delve too deep, but it is definitely, like employee handbooks and just small stuff that you don't really think about, that when you're an owner operator that you don't necessarily need. But once you definitely start hiring employees, it's just little details like that you got to think about. So we'll definitely get into that the later episodes. I don't want to delve too deep into that currently. But I want you, and unfortunately I haven't read this book. It's one that I definitely need to read, but I want you to touch on Michael Gerber and the E-Myth.
Ah, yes. Okay. Entrepreneurs everywhere. It's time to add to your library. If you have not read this book, the E-Myth, or the E-Myth Revisited by Michael Gerber, it's one of those foundational books, and it will help you when deciding what you want your end to look like. It's a book that talks about essentially every business. You have a technician, a manager, and a visionary. There's other writers that have come out since Michael Gerber, but I would say he was really the pioneer with this systems and processes and these positions. But there's other really great books that have come out since that talk about a lot of what Michael talks about in his book, but also goes a little bit deeper or kind of has variations or different spins on it. But essentially, Michael Gerber's E-Myth Revisited is one of those books that you should read early on. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking about taking the leap into getting into business, or you're listening to this, you've already taken the leap and you're in business, this book is good no matter what stage you're at. So to give you some personal experience, I talked to a person in the junk removal industry when I first started. I might have already told this story, but like 2 months into starting the business, I tore my meniscus. So here I am starting a junk removal business where we pick things up, put things down, and I've got torn meniscus, right? So I tried to find other ways to help the business during that time, and I learned search engine optimization, and I reached out to a bunch of other people in the industry to get advice. And one individual said to me, he goes, "Hey, what I would tell you," and he had been in business for 3 to 4 years, and he's now built at the time he was at the time when I reached out to him close to the size that we are now. So at that time he was already over 7 figures, but he wasn't franchising yet. This guy's now got 118 trucks and 40 locations.
Not bad.
Not bad, right? And we still stay in touch and we're friends, even though we're still in the junk removal industry. We still stay in touch and have bounce ideas off each other. It's just when you meet people, it's okay to be a competitor and still talk, right? But anyway, so here's this guy who's obviously had massive success, and he's saying, "Hey, you know what you need to do? Read these books. It teaches you about growth, about processes, systems, culture, etc." And I should have read the book at that time, but I did not read the book at that time and take his advice. And so 4 years of growing the business later, I finally read the E-Myth Revisited, and it just completely opens your eyes. You have like these moments where you're listening and hearing feedback from somebody, and you're like, it just pings. You're like, oh man, that's me. I'm doing some of the things that are being outlined in this book. And what's great about the E-Myth, man, pinging light bulb, right?
Yeah.
And what's great about this book is they do a scenario with someone who's owning a business, and they're in a lot of what we just talked about, where they're the person baking the pies, selling the pies, doing the accounts receivable. Like they're wearing all the hats, which in a business, there's a lot of hats to wear. And in that book, this person's wearing them all and she's just burning out. And so similar to the scenario we described where you're a firefighter and your days off, you're like, oh, I'm just going to have a little side hustle. Well, if you're just going into it to make a little extra money and you're going to do all the work yourself, that's different than like if the other scenario we presented where when you reach a certain age, you don't want to be doing the work anymore. You want to be the person moving into managing the business where somebody else is doing the work. Now we're talking about a lot of what the E-Myth is going to unpack for you and at least open your eyes to. Again, there's a lot of books that Jeff and I will talk about with this podcast. This is just one, but the E-Myth really does a great job of conveying the pain of being the person trying to do everything yourself in whatever business that is. So, I mean, a lot of firemen cut grass, right? So if you're cutting grass on your days off and you're doing everything yourself, you're going to be able to relate to some of the challenges that the character in the E-Myth Revisited is going through. Because there's a piece where it's a fictional scenario and she's going through the pain. And I'm sure he brought this character into the book because it was somebody that he had coached at one time. So it might not be fictional from that regard, but but all the pain that person goes through because she's trying to wear all the hats at once. And then she just reaches like a breaking point. And so again, back to the beginning with the end in mind for the firepreneur out there who's like, well, I want to do the work myself to a certain age, and then I want to pivot to managing the business. In the E-Myth, they talk about 3 roles. There's the technician, there's the manager, and there's the visionary. The visionary is building the trajectory of growing the company. The manager is managing the workflow and the systems and processes of the business. Your technician is performing the work of the business in a very simplified version of, and I'm not going to disrespect Michael Gerber at all. I'm not trying to simplify his book to that by any means, but that kind of breaks down like the different roles of the business. And it just kind of, at a certain size, you can't do all 3 anymore. you got to bring people in. And once you bring people in, that's where our mission comes in, is you've got to lead, develop, and grow those people.
Yes.
And so, beginning with the end in mind, introduction episode, a book that you could probably pick up and get some good insight on as to what you want your end to look like. That was one that I would definitely either read. If you're a reader at night, you can sit down and block off some time and read. I would encourage that. If not, there's an audio version of it as well. If you're driving to and from the firehouse or to and from, wherever you're going, it's definitely an easy listen as well. And you'll just have these moments, like Jeff said, light bulb moments as you're listening to it. It'll just fire, keep your eyes on the road while you're listening to it when those light bulbs go off. But yeah, it's definitely one that early on in your entrepreneurial career, you should listen to. And even if you are a few years in and you're an idiot like me who ignores the advice of clearly successful people in the early stubborn stages of building a business, I wish I would have listened to it at the beginning. If I could go back, it's one that definitely would have been one of the starting books I would have read for sure.
Yeah, and it's I know I've done a lot of networking in the past, and people with entrepreneurs, small businesses, and that's just a giant step a lot of people think about in general, right? Is they're out there doing the work, they're selling the business, they're wearing all the hats, right? And it's to bring somebody in is a scary step for somebody, right? Because it's your baby. You started it. You know the work that's getting out there and getting done because you're doing it. Now you're bringing somebody else in. Are they going to live up to the same standards that you have? How are they going to treat your customers? How are they going to do the work? Are you going to have to start giving refunds, right? Are you going to start hemorrhaging money now just because you brought somebody in to do this work? So there's definitely a lot to it. And it's a decision, again, why you have to start with the end in mind of where you want your business to go, right? Because if you get to that stage of, I just want to be the only one doing this, you're going to have to say no to customers, and that's not an easy thing to do either.
Yep.
But you have to know that ahead of time. Yep. If you're willing to say no to customers to stay at the size you're at, that's perfectly fine. But it's not easy, and that's kind of where people start to get into that. They're growing and don't want to say no to somebody, and it's too much.
So like what you're saying too, a question pops in my head that I think would be good for the listeners to think about is, what hats do you want to wear?
Yes.
So what Jeff's talking about is like, you're going to have all these hats, but which ones do you see yourself wanting to wear? So let's talk about you, right? So Jeff started out in our company doing the work, driver and remover. At the time, it was just a remover at the time when we were just getting started, right? Went through every position in the company, and now here he is. He's a full-time firefighter at IFD. And, so you have a little bit of a beginning with the end in mind, even as a team member in a company, right? So like Jeff still works with Fire Dogs Junk Roll and is a huge leader in our company. And he has a lot of people that look up to him and that he is leading, developing, and growing.
Hopefully.
Yeah. I mean, outside the door right now, we're doing a podcast. People are throwing tomatoes at the window because I just said that. No, I mean, so like, and that's Jeff leading without me. So that's him. And so even inside of an organization, you have to begin with an end in mind, like, what do you see yourself doing in the company? And then once you get there, are you going to be happy? And so like, even in an organization, you may start out as doing one task, just like the E-Myth we'll talk about. You may start off doing the driver and remover work, the technician work, but you may see yourself growing and evolving into something different in the company. And so you don't have to be a business owner to begin with the end in mind at all. You could be a team member that sees yourself starting here, learning the nuts and bolts of the business, and then evolving into something different in the company, like you as an example. So Jeff's now the president of Fire Dogs Junk Removal, and he's leading classes in our Fire Dogs Academy, teaching leadership and training. He does, high-level sales for us, meeting with big contract opportunities, and he also helps with teaching classes leading daily operations. So Jeff's an example. The guy that nobody can see right now behind this, that set this podcast up. I like to think that he would have been cast in Stranger Things when he was a wee young Matthew Olson. But he started out working for us as an entry-level call center rep, dispatch center. He went out and learned the nuts and bolts of the business. He's rode the trucks. He's been a crew chief. And look, his role in 3 years has evolved from learning how to quote junk removal jobs and do junk removal jobs and take care of our customers to then, answering calls from customers, scheduling those jobs, making sure the customer's satisfied, learning those ins and outs. So now he's helping lead the training of some of those skills of dispatch and customer service and scheduling jobs, while also growing even further into now he's the one managing and distributing our podcast. So inside your organization, beginning with the end in mind, you have to think about, do you want to create opportunities like that for your team where you lead, develop, and grow your people? And if that sounds exciting to you, then great. That's a different end than the one where you're just making enough money to hit a certain earnings benchmark, right?
Definitely.
And so back to what we were talking about a second ago, which is the hats. What hats do you see yourself wearing as a business owner? What hat do you see yourself wearing as maybe a team member, as maybe you're a firefighter, and we're not even talking about business at this point. We're saying like, hey, my end in mind is like, I grew up, I want to be a fire chief. That's it. I'm going to be a fire chief. That's a great end in mind. Like if that's your end in mind, get ready to put in the work and the time and the energy to doing everything along the way so that you can get to that end. Because if that's your end inside of an organization like a fire department where you want to be the fire chief, you're going to look back to Jeff's tree example earlier. It's not going to be a lot of zigzags per se, because you always had that end in mind of reaching fire chief. So when you look back, that was always your tree that you were walking towards the whole time.
Right. Yeah, and I think one thing that we can say too is that we relate this a lot to business. Obviously, that's what the topic of this. But even if you're not currently a business owner, even if you don't plan on starting your own business, you can apply this to anything. The fire department, you can apply it to your current job. So a lot of the stuff that we talk about, you can definitely use and utilize. Anybody, what I'm basically getting at is anybody can have the entrepreneurial spirit. You don't have to be a business owner to have that. Just kind of that showing drive and initiative. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on too, kind of what you were talking about, what you like to do and don't like to do, is as your business grows, and especially if you bring on employees, you're going to uncover quickly strengths and weaknesses of yourself. So that's kind of how our partnership has developed. If anybody follows disc profiling, Bennett here is a high D.
Say what?
Or DC, if I remember right. So you like your math as a path, you're a numbers guy, and
yeah, I think that when I looked at my last disc assessment, it didn't even give me 2 letters. It gave me like D. And then, obviously when you get your little graph, it's got the bar,
right,
and the D line. The D graph is like way high. And then there's like the other ones I have components of the other ones too.
Right.
I think everybody has components of each.
Yes.
But then like you are normally one higher than the other. And a lot of people come back like, SI or SC or DI no, mine was just D. Yeah, it was just the D.
So that's using that as an example. I'm a CS or SC, I believe. So I'm kind of like a very literal and numbers and analytical.
Jeff grunts a lot too, by the way.
Yeah.
You'll say something that makes sense, Jeff will go,
Yeah. So
that's the literal side of you, right?
Yes. And
point made, man.
Yes.
Good point. Me approve.
I think a lot in my head and don't necessarily communicate out. Goes out a lot. Hence the grunting. So that's where we play back and forth. And I know you've definitely shaped and developed as a leader through your role of running this business,
sure,
and kind of learned where your weaknesses are.
Yep.
And that's really kind of how our partnership has developed. And you've brought other people in on the team too that right? Either one, I can do this well, but I don't like to do it. You're in that position that you can bring somebody in to take that off your plate, or that that I'm not good at this. I need somebody to take this over. So
we should do an episode on disc, by the way.
Yeah.
We really should. We should do a full episode on disc and how that can, because what Jeff's also talking about here is not only knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, but like complementing them with people around you that fill in your gaps per se.
Yes.
Surrounding yourself with people that you have a strength. Now let's let's bring in somebody that can help with one of my weaknesses, which is what you do for me, right? So like, and I think every organization should have that. You shouldn't have, if you had a team of 5 people, not everybody should be a high D. My goodness. But for anybody listening who doesn't understand DISC, like we'll do an episode on DISC. I know a handful of people that are experts in putting it in place. I think your sister is really good at it too, right?
Yes.
So there's people we can bring on that can talk about it and unpack like how to implement it, how to do it, and how to use the data that you get from it. So for sure, we need to do an episode on DISC. But back to your point, people. Bringing them in. Once you bring them in and like you're beginning with the end in mind, now you've got a bag of personalities.
Right.
So if you're sitting here listening to this and you're like, man, that sounds like a lot of work. I don't want to do that. You know, I just want to go cut grass. Like, keep cutting grass. Just you don't want to mess with it. If it doesn't sound like an end in mind for you, you don't have to.
Right.
You don't need to. And that's the thing about business that's beautiful is that you can get out of it what you want as long as you're thinking about your whys and setting your end in mind and setting your target. And then you can get there very many different ways. We'll help talk about a lot of those ways, but I just think that having some idea of the end in mind is what's going to give you, to Jeff's analogy, when you look back at your snow path, it's going to be the closest thing to a straight line.
Right.
In life, there's not really a straight line, though, but it's the closest thing you're going to get to it, I think.
Exactly. Yeah.
What else you got, Goose?
So this topic covers a lot. Obviously, that's why we're doing a series on it. So I don't want to delve too deep, and because I think we'll get off on tangents here and cover topics we're going to cover later. So definitely stay tuned. We'll bring some people on besides just hearing our lovely voices and seeing our nice, pretty faces at the moment. We'll get some other
oh shucks, as Johnny Baker would say.
Yeah. So we'll get some other people involved and delve deeper into this topic for sure.
Yeah, and just to close for me, one thing I would say to anybody out there listening is, and this is kind of a comment that, you know, we will talk about this in future episodes too, because I think it's incredibly important, is that as you are considering your whys, you're considering your end in mind, a segue topic that we will get into after we finish this series is surrounding yourself with those on the same mission as you. Put another way is, I just read Jeff Duden's book, Discernment. He says it pretty well. Like, and then he's not the only one that said this. He's probably gotten it from other people. It's just one of those things that people have said for so long, but it's so true that it's just important. Is show me your friends and I'll show you your future. So, you know, surrounding yourself with those on the same mission as you. Show me your friends, I'll show you your future. You know, as you think about your whys and your end in mind, be careful about who you surround yourself and share that information with, because they can definitely change your trajectory if you put too much stock in what they have to say. So always stay confident in who you are, stay confident in your gut. Be careful about surrounding yourself with people who are going to, you know, crap on your dreams, right? So if you have a why, you're feeling good about it, you set your end, and then you go maybe into the firehouse and somebody completely dumps on the idea. You know, that may set you back, dude. So just be careful about who you surround yourself with. We're going to do a full episode on this, though, because it's also another one of those deep topics that we need to have more examples. But I would just say it's applicable enough to the introduction episode of beginning with the end in mind, that who you surround yourself with and who you share your dreams and visions with can be dangerous. So just be careful with that. And I think from there, we will save the rest for the upcoming episodes. What do you think, bud?
Yeah, that sounds good to me.
Okay, that wraps it up.
Thanks for joining Firepreneurs today. We hope that we delivered value in your leadership journey. We humbly ask that you take the time to leave us a 5-star review, as that's how our podcast will rise in rankings and become available to more people. We'd love to hear from you, so you can email us by emailing firepreneurs@gmail.com. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, or by watching us on our Firepreneurs YouTube channel. Stay hungry and get after it.